January 14, 1945, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. A young captain walked through the snow. He was looking for a missing patrol. What he found stopped him cold. 200 American soldiers, sitting upright against the trees, eyes open, rifles still in their hands. None of them moving, none of them breathing, frozen solid where they sat. Captain David Holloway took off his glove. He touched the shoulder of the closest man. The cloth was hard as stone. The boy's face was blue. His lips were parted like he'd been about to say something. There was frost in his eyelashes. 200 boys. From Texas, from Maine, from Indiana, from every corner of America. Sent into the worst winter Europe had seen in 40 years. Wearing summer field jackets, leather boots with no insulation, no mittens, no wool socks. The temperature that night had dropped to 20 below zero. They had no chance. Holloway counted them. Twice. 203 to be exact. He found a sergeant still clutching a photograph. He found a private with a half-written letter frozen to his glove. He found a corporal who'd died trying to light a match. The match head was still pressed between his thumb and finger. Holloway turned away from the trees. He vomited into the snow. Then he reached for his radio. What happened next would become one of the most painful decisions of the entire war. Because when the report reached headquarters, the brass had a choice. Bury these boys quickly, quietly. Blame the cold, blame the Germans, move on, or admit the truth. That the United States Army had sent 200 of its own sons into a Belgian winter without the gear to survive it. That somewhere along the supply chain somebody had failed, and these boys had paid for it with their lives. This is the story of what General George S. Patton said when they handed him that choice. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that force us to look at the hardest moments. The moments when honor and silence stood on opposite sides of the same grave. To understand what Holloway found in that forest, you have to understand the winter of 1944. The Germans had launched their last great offensive on December 16th. They called it the Ardennes Offensive. Americans called it the Battle of the Bulge. It was a desperate gamble by Hitler to split the Allies in two, and it caught the American line completely by surprise. But the bigger enemy wasn't German. It was the cold. That December was the coldest winter Northern Europe had seen since 1893. Snow fell 5 feet deep in some places. The thermometer dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks. Men's eyelids froze shut, rifles jammed because the oil turned to glue, and the supply lines, stretched thin from Normandy to the Rhine, hadn't caught up. The winter clothing was sitting in warehouses in France. The shoe packs, the wool overcoats, the fur-lined gloves. All of it stuck behind a paperwork jam that nobody had bothered to fix. So the boys at the front fought in what they had. Summer uniforms, cotton long johns, boots designed for autumn rain in Georgia, not Belgian ice. Captain David Holloway, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 28 years old, a Graves registration officer with the 3rd Army. He'd been doing this job for 7 months. He'd buried boys in Normandy. He'd buried boys in Lorraine. He'd buried more men than he could count. But he wasn't hard yet. He still cried in his bunk at night. He still kept the letters his wife sent him in his breast pocket against his heart. That morning, January 14th, 1945, a runner came to his tent. A patrol from the 28th Infantry Division had gone missing 3 days earlier. Last seen heading into the woods east of Wiltz. Holloway saddled up his jeep with 2 enlisted men and went to find them. They followed the patrol's tracks through the snow. The tracks led deep into the forest. 2 miles in, the tracks stopped. And that's when Holloway saw them. 200 boys, sitting in a rough circle, like they'd stopped to rest, like they'd been waiting for someone to come get them. Holloway walked among them. He read the dog tags. PFC Tommy Riley, Brooklyn, New York, age 19. Private Earl Vance, Tulsa, Oklahoma, age 20. Sergeant Anthony Russo, Newark, New Jersey, age 23. Each one a boy, each one someone's son. He found the letter on Riley. It was tucked inside the boy's jacket, frozen against his ribs. The envelope was addressed in a woman's handwriting. The return address read, Mrs. Margaret Riley, 142 Bleecker Street, Brooklyn. The letter was from his mother. Holloway slid the letter into his own coat. He couldn't read it. Not yet. He walked back to the jeep and got on the radio. He said the words slow. 200 dead. American boys. Frozen. No combat wounds. No enemy fire. Just the cold. There was a long silence on the other end. Then a voice came back. The voice belonged to Major Thomas Cleary, Boston, Massachusetts, 41 years old. a career officer who'd served in the trenches in 1918 and knew what frozen men looked like. Cleary said, "Captain, do not move those bodies. Do not photograph them. I'm coming to you." Within hours, Cleary's jeep arrived at the clearing. He walked the same path Holloway had walked. He counted the same boys. He saw the letter, the matchstick, the photograph still in the sergeant's frozen hand, and his face got harder with each step. Cleary turned to Holloway and said, "Who else knows?" Holloway said, "Just my men." Cleary nodded. "Keep it that way for now." But Holloway didn't move. He said, "Sir, with respect, these boys froze to death because we didn't get them winter gear. Their mothers deserve to know that." Cleary looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines. Snow drifted down from the high branches. Somewhere in the distance, an artillery round thumped. Cleary said, "Captain, you go telling people the army let 200 boys freeze and you'll start a fire that won't stop burning. Generals will lose their jobs. The Germans will use it for propaganda. The mothers back home will start demanding answers. And the war isn't over yet, son. We still have boys fighting." Holloway said, "So we lie to them?" Cleary said nothing. That night, Cleary sent a sealed report up the chain to Colonel Henry Webster at 12th Army Group. Webster read it twice. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, Webster had a position. Bury the boys. List them as killed in action. Tell the families they died bravely fighting Germans. Protect the army. Protect the war effort. Protect the chain of command that had failed these boys in the first place. Webster sent the report to Patton's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay. Gay was a quiet man, a Texas cattleman before the war. He read the report at his desk in Luxembourg. He read it 3 times. Then he walked to Patton's office. Patton was on the phone. Gay waited. When Patton hung up, Gay set the report on his desk. He said, "General, you need to see this." Patton picked up the papers. He started reading. His face got harder with each line. He turned a page, then another. He stopped at the page that listed the boys by name. 203 names, 203 hometowns, 203 ages, mostly between 19 and 22. Patton was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Get my driver. We're going there." Gay said, "General, the recommendation from Webster is to keep this quiet." Patton said, "Get my driver, Hobart." What would you do, sitting at that desk? Would you protect the institution that had let those boys freeze? Or would you protect the truth, even if the truth cost you everything? Patton's jeep rolled into the clearing at 4:17 p.m. the next afternoon. The light was already dying. The pines threw long blue shadows across the snow. 200 boys still sat there, exactly as Holloway had found them. Captain Holloway stood at attention. Major Cleary stood beside him. Colonel Webster had flown in from headquarters. Patton got out of the jeep. He didn't speak. He walked into the trees. He went to the first boy. He looked at the dog tag. He moved to the next, and the next. He read every name. He read every hometown. He counted them himself, the way he always did, the way some men count rosary beads. It took him over an hour. The sun went down. Someone lit a lantern. Patton kept walking, kept reading. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every officer there had stopped working, stopped breathing, stopped thinking about anything except the man in the riding boots walking among the frozen dead. When Patton reached the last boy, he stood there a long time. The lantern light flickered on the frost. Then he turned around and walked back to the clearing where the officers stood. He looked at Colonel Webster first. His voice was quiet, too quiet. He said, "Colonel, tell me about the supply situation." Webster started to explain. The shipping bottlenecks, the Red Ball Express, the priority given to ammunition and fuel, the winter gear that had been delayed, then delayed again. Patton listened. He didn't interrupt. When Webster finished, Patton was silent for another long moment. Then he said, "How long have those parkas been sitting in Cherbourg?" Webster said, "Sir, approximately 6 weeks." Patton nodded slowly. He looked back at the trees, at the boys sitting in the snow. He said, 6 weeks. Nobody said anything. Then Patton spoke. His voice stayed quiet, but every word landed like a hammer. "Gentlemen, let me tell you what we are not going to do. We are not going to bury these boys in a hole in the ground and tell their mothers they died of combat wounds. We are not going to lie to 200 American families to protect the careers of supply officers who couldn't get a parka onto a truck. We are not going to do that. Not on my watch, not in my army." He paused. He looked at Webster. "You're a good officer, Colonel. You've served honorably. I respect that. And I know the logic of what you're proposing. Cover it up. Move on. Win the war. I understand the argument, but there's something you didn't understand when you wrote that report. The silence deepened. These boys didn't die for the Army. They died because of the Army, and the Army owes them the truth, every one of them, by name. Patton turned to Captain Holloway. The young man stood at attention, snow on his shoulders. Captain, what's your name? Holloway, sir. Where you from, son? Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, sir. How long you been doing graves registration? 7 months, sir. Patton looked at him for a long moment. He said, Holloway, you're done with graves registration. As of right now, you're my special liaison for this matter. You're going to identify every single one of these boys. You're going to write up a full report on each one. You're going to take charge of returning their personal effects to their families, and you're going to do it with the dignity these men earned the day they put on the uniform. Holloway said, Yes, sir. Patton said, And one more thing, Captain. You're going to deliver that letter you've been carrying. Holloway looked up, surprised. He hadn't said anything about the letter. Patton had seen it in his pocket. Patton said, Whoever it belongs to, you make sure his mother gets it back, in your own hand. Yes, sir. Then Patton turned to Hobart Gay. His voice stayed level. Hobart, I want a full investigation of the supply chain failure. Names, dates, who held those parkas in Cherbourg and why. I want it on my desk in 7 days, and I want every man at the front in proper winter gear inside 2 weeks, not 3. 2. I don't care if you have to drive the trucks yourself. Gay said, Yes, sir. Patton looked at Webster one more time. Colonel, there's an old saying, a coward dies 1,000 deaths. A brave man dies but once. Today, the United States Army is going to die a hard death. We're going to admit what happened to these boys. We're going to take the punishment, and then we're going to make damn sure it never happens again. That's the only way these boys' deaths mean anything. He paused. We didn't fight this war to protect ourselves from the truth. We fought it for them. He pointed at the trees. Then he walked back to his jeep. By morning, every single one of the 203 boys had been carried out of the forest. Each body was tagged, identified, and prepared for proper burial with full military honors. Patton's staff wrote individual letters to every family. Patton signed each one personally. He sat at his desk for 2 days and signed 203 letters. The supply investigation began within 48 hours. 3 colonels and 1 brigadier general were quietly reassigned. Within 10 days, every man on the 3rd Army's front line had a wool overcoat, lined gloves, and shoe-pack boots. Patton drove some of those trucks himself, the rumor went. Whether that's true or not, nobody was going to ask him. Captain David Holloway took the train to Brooklyn 3 weeks later. He stood on the front step of 142 Bleecker Street with PFC Tommy Riley's letter in his hand. The envelope was warped from being frozen. Margaret Riley opened the door. She was a small woman, 45 years old, wearing an apron. She looked at the uniform on her front step and she already knew. Holloway took off his cap. He gave her the letter. He told her that her son had been found in a forest in Belgium, that he had been carrying her words against his heart when he died, and that General Patton himself had asked Holloway to deliver it. Margaret Riley read her own letter, the one she'd written to Tommy 3 weeks before he died. She read it standing in her doorway. Then she sat down on the step and cried. Holloway sat next to her. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Years later, when Holloway was an old man living back in Pittsburgh, his grandson asked him what the war was really like. Holloway thought about it for a long time. Then he told his grandson about a clearing in Belgium, about 200 boys sitting in the snow, about a general in riding boots walking among them with a lantern. He said, That's the day I understood what kind of country we were supposed to be. Not the country that wins, the country that tells the truth to a mother on her front step. We had a general who knew the difference. That was Patton. Holloway kept Tommy Riley's mother's letter for the rest of his life. Margaret had given it back to him before he left her step that day. She told him, You bring this home, so somebody remembers. It sat in a frame on his mantle in Pittsburgh until the day he died in 1987. Patton never spoke about that day in the Ardennes Forest. He never wrote about it in his diary. He never told the story at dinners or in interviews. But every officer who was there remembered. They remembered the lantern light on the frost. They remembered the quiet voice. They remembered the man who refused to let 200 American boys be buried under a lie. 203 letters went out to 203 families. Everyone signed by hand. Everyone telling the truth about how their boy had died. And everyone carrying the same closing line in Patton's own hand. Your son did not die in vain. He died because of a failure that will not be allowed to happen again. I am sorry. I am responsible. And I will carry his name with me until the end of this war. He signed everyone, G.S. Patton, Lieutenant General, 3rd Army. If you had been at Patton's desk that night with the truth in front of you and the chance to bury it, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about World War II and the men who chose honor when silence would have been easier, make sure to subscribe.